All right, I'd like to call to order the August 15, 2023 meeting of the West Palm Beach Planning Board. Madam Clerk, if you kindly call the roll.
Will Carante,
Here.
Patrick Mayfield,
Here.
Stephen Mayans,
Here?
Jean Marcel Jr.,
Here. And you'll note the absences then for the record.
Deborah Rain, let the record reflect that she is not here. Peter Pivko, let the record reflect that he is not here. Andres Paradello, let the record reflect that he is not here.
Thank you so much. Next order of business is approval of the July 18, 2023 minutes. Has everyone had the opportunity to review them? Are there any corrections or changes? If not, I'm looking for a motion for approval.
I'll move to approve.
Okay, motion, and we'll call that a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. Next on our agenda is report of the planning staff.
Evening. Chair and board members, Angela Van, Planning and Zoning Administrator. It's a quick update on the cases you saw since your last meeting. First case is Palm Beach Atlantic Major Amendment. Was a major amendment for a proposed school of business. Also included a right-of-way abandonment for a portion of Gerber Place. Commission did approve that at their July 24th commission meeting by a vote of 5-0. Next was the Cox Science Center and Aquarium CSPD. This was a rezoning to a CSPD for allow the Science Museum to do approximately 73,000 square foot expansion. And also we did a text amendment associated with this to allow CSPDs to be eligible for parking waivers. You heard this in your June 20th meeting, and commission approved, final approval on August 7th, 2003. Favorite case, 1525 North Flagler Drive was for the dock extension. Was for the construction of a about 282-foot-long dock. You heard this at your June 20th planning board meeting, and you approved it by a vote of 3-2. Commission heard this at their August 7th meeting, and they approved it 4-1. That concludes staff's presentation.
Any questions of staff? Thank you so much, Angela. Next on our agenda are remarks by the chairperson, of which I have none. Next is declaration of ex parte communications, and Mr. Thomas advises us that is something we should still do. So I will begin by saying that I have had no ex parte communications. I have received no written communications. I have conducted no investigations. I have made no site visits. I have received no expert opinions. I request that these disclosures and all written communications be made a part of the record. So Will, let's go with you then next.
As to the matters this evening, I have not had any ex parte communications. I have not received written communications. I have not conducted an investigation. I have not made a site visit. I have not received expert opinions. I request that these disclosures and all written communications be made part of the record.
Patrick?
As to the matter of all agenda items this evening, I have not had ex parte communications. I have not received written communications. I have not conducted an investigation. I have not made a site visit, and I have not received expert opinions. I request that these disclosures and all written communications be made part of the record.
As to all matters on the agenda, I have not had ex parte communications. I have not received written communications. I have not conducted an investigation. I have not made a site visit. I have not received expert opinions. I request that these disclosures and all written communications be made part of the record.
And just to confirm, you do not believe we need to swear in any witnesses at this point, Mr. Thomas? Okay. So next on the agenda are continued cases, of which there are none, planning board cases, of which there is none, code revision cases, of which there is none. That brings us to other business.
Good evening. For the record, Alex Hansen, City's Comprehensive Planner. The item that we want to present to you tonight is a workshop for a discussion on the evaluation and appraisal review, or EAR, of the comprehensive plan. Florida statutes, chapter 163, indicate that at least every 7 years, each local government in the state shall evaluate its comprehensive plan and determine whether changes to the comprehensive plan are required. So again, every municipality in the state has to go through this process. There's a number of requirements associated with the EAR. There are also some penalties for municipalities that do not comply with that, including a prohibition from processing any amendments to the comprehensive plan until the EAR is complete. As I indicated, EARs are supposed to be completed every 7 years. In the case of West Palm Beach, the state, which also determines the deadlines, indicated that we had to send a letter to the state indicating whether we thought that an EAR process was required, whether changes to the comprehensive plan were going to be required through the EAR process. The deadline for the city to indicate this to the state was December 1st of 2022. So on November 29th of last year, we submitted a letter to the state indicating that we had reviewed the comprehensive plan and we had determined that changes to it were necessary. In response to that, the state then indicated that we had 12 months, or until November 29th of 2023, in order to transmit any amendments to the comprehensive plan as part of the EAR process. A little bit of comprehensive planning background as far as the city of West Palm Beach. We have 13 elements in our comprehensive plan. Most of these elements are required by state statutes. We have just a few that are optional elements that the city decided to include in the comprehensive plan. These are examples: future land use element, transportation element. Just a reminder, the elements are mostly a part of the city's vision of how we want to grow. They're composed mostly of goals, objectives, and policies, again, for all these different subjects. In addition, the city's comprehensive plan includes 26 maps. These maps deal with infrastructure, also deal with natural resources, showcase the location of certain critical facilities, service areas, for example. So we have a variety of maps. Most of them are also required by state statutes, so it's something that we have to include in the comprehensive plan. We have been meeting with different departments over the last few months in order to determine what types of changes were needed for the different elements. So I'm going to give a summary of some of the main items that we have preliminarily identified. We're still working on this. For the introduction and administration element, we are going to update some of the references to the EAR processes. We have some references to what we did 7 and 14 years ago. Now we need to update those references. We also need to include some references to the property rights element, which is a new element that was required by the state a couple years ago. We adopted this element, but now we need to identify it in the introduction and administration element as one of the elements that is included in the comprehensive plan. Also, we need to change references to a number of agencies. One example, as indicated there, we still have some references to the Palm Beach Metropolitan Planning Organization. That agency changed its name to the Transportation Planning Agency about 4 or 5 years ago, which was after the last EAR process that we went through. We are also going to be changing some definitions in the introduction administration element. They're mostly related to housing. With regards to the future land use element, we're going to be updating some references to the Historic Preservation Ordinance. We're also going to be reviewing some development caps for the Northwood Mixed Use District, or NMUD. So all of our mixed use districts have both a residential as well as a non-residential cap. In the case of NMUD, The cap is of 650 residential units and 850,000 square feet of non-residential uses. Between development that is already existing there, as well as development that was recently approved, we're very close to reaching the cap on the residential uses once those new developments are built. However, we still have a significant amount of non-residential development available. So the idea of what we're proposing, will be proposing, is to reduce the cap for non-residential, because we have over 550,000 square feet of non-residential uses, which we do not believe are going to be built for the most part, and transfer some of that non-residential unbuilt capacity to the residential uses. So that is one of the amendments that we're proposing. In addition, we're going to include some references to the implementation of some of the more recent housing bills and housing legislation that was approved by the state. Dodi is going to be providing a little bit more detail on that in a few minutes. As far as the transportation element, we're going to be updating a number of references to different mobility or transportation options, some of the different agencies, again, MPO to TPA, and also different studies and plans. The city has adopted a number of transportation-related plans and studies over the last few years, and those are not currently reflected in the transportation element. So we're going to be updating it to reflect those. We're going to be changing some references to an Australian Avenue crawls. Crawls is a constrained roadway at a lower level of service designation. Our language in our comprehensive plan has some slight differences to the county's language in their comprehensive plan, and those two should be consistent with each other. We're also going to be processing some updates to a right-of-way setback table. This is an appendix to the transportation element, outlines the maximum right-of-way width for a number of roadways. We have determined that some of the rights-of-way amounts or the road included for some of those roadways are inaccurate, so we're going to be changing that table to provide the accurate dimensions for the ultimate right-of-way for those roads. Housing element, we're going to be dealing with some duplicative policies, and as well as updating some references to attainable housing that will now be called affordable housing. We're going to be updating also some references to different federal estate housing programs, updating city population projections that are included in the element, as well as some of the language dealing with the new housing bills that I just indicated that Dodi is going to mention in a few minutes. Utilities element, we need to update a city's water level of service. We had two different levels of service in different documents. We're going to make them consistent. We're also going to be updating our planning horizon from to 10 years and 20 years. This is a new state requirement. Before, planning horizons needed to be 5 and 10 years. Now the state in recent legislation indicated that the planning horizon has to be 10 years and 20 years. We're also going to be updating the city's water supply plan. This is different data, population, water supply sources, as well as treatment strategies. Recreation and open space element, we're going to have some updates for different timelines or deadlines for plans, different plans, reports, and studies that are referenced in that element. Capital improvement element, couple of significant things. One is we're going to be updating some policies in order to beef up the language that we have in that basically calls for the need for developments to help pay for the infrastructure that is needed in order for that development to function from a water and sewer and utility standpoint. We're also going to be updating the city's 5-year capital improvement program, or CIP. For the downtown master plan element, we're proposing some updates on text dealing with population and development that is in the introduction to the downtown master plan element. And we're also going to be updating and clarifying some policies in order to reflect some more recent or current practices and programs. I had mentioned earlier that we have 26 maps in the comprehensive plan. All of these maps are going to have to be updated in order to reflect changes to the city's boundaries. This is as a result of annexations that we have processed over the last few years. And also the content for a number of these maps is going to have to be updated. Again, we're dealing with infrastructure, with critical facilities, and a lot of that has changed over the last few years. So those maps are going to be updated as part of this process. And now with regards to housing, Dodi is going to be providing you with more information.
Good evening, Dodi Glass. I'm the Assistant Director for Development Services. And we've been talking about housing policy for a couple of years now. And last year, at the very end of the year, in December, we adopted Resolution 306-22, which was in response to state legislation, and that was House Bill 1339. And when we created those provisions, we actually created an interim program, and the game plan was we were going to be going forward with code amendments for more detailed implementation for the provisions we had created under 306. Meanwhile, this year, the state legislature created another housing act and amended some of the provisions that we had included in the interim program. So what we have found is that some of the new provisions, which were under Senate Bill 102, the Live Local Act, reversed some of the things, not only that we had decided that the city thought was a good thing to do, and we had developers interested in doing, it sort of was changing all the rules on us. So since we had the EAR open already, the thought was, well, we could make some changes to our own comp plan, create the provisions in our comp plan going forward. And to be honest, there's in some ways some similarities between the legislation, but there were also nuances that were different, and some of that was related to the fact more urban areas, probably like the city, looked at it differently than some of the non-urban areas, and that's what created some friction at the state legislature in terms of the way the policy was being looked at. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So under the old House Bill provisions and what we did in 306-22, they created a provision that allowed for us to consider what we would call a self-amending process, meaning you don't have to come in and do a comp plan amendment, but you could get additional density without doing that land use change on behalf of providing workforce or affordable housing. That's a big deal because that's usually a year process, takes a lot of money. We thought that was good. And they were also encouraging that we add housing to other land use categories that didn't typically have residential use associated with them, like commercial and industrial. Okay, we created provisions, we're going forward with that. And then what happened under the new legislation was they took out the residential land use. The reason why that was a big deal is we were looking at some of our multifamily districts, and we were basically going to double density under 306. That all went away under 102, and we could no longer have a self-amending plan. The only way we could do that is to go back and put provisions in the comp plan. So we said, okay, we're right in the middle of EAR, we can jump in the middle of that, and that's why Alex was saying we're going to make some amendments to future land use and to the housing element so that we can create this provision to allow us to continue sort of in this vein of looking at density in residential districts. So that's one of the differences between these two pieces. The other thing was the way that they wanted you to look at density. It tied it to what was allowed for residential in your jurisdiction. So the highest density that we subscribe to is the 32.27 units per acre. That's what multifamily permits. Under what we have provided for under 306, again, there are cases where we would look at going up to as high as 64 DUs an acre, and we had some preliminary criteria in the interim program. We would prefer to be able to adjust our densities based on location and allocate accordingly. The provisions were not set up that way under 102. There were also provisions that impacted, along with residential, the fact that they were encouraging more mixed-use development, And in that mixed-use development, they were setting some thresholds and creating provisions that would change the way we thought provisions would go for mixed-use projects. Specifically, what they were saying is they were creating a provision so that you could expedite the process for mixed use by having an administrative process of review, but only under certain circumstances. That also would relate back to the fact that the density would be limited for us, and it would also look at sort of these provisions for how height could be dealt with, which in our mixed-use categories, a lot of times we deal with form. We don't deal with necessarily units per acre, and so that was another thing that in mixed use became a little more problematic. So what we thought we'd do in our EAR is create some provisions to allow us to do that. So for height, what we had done is we defaulted to the multifamily district and then allowed for variances and waivers to give relief from things like setbacks and other land development regulations that might apply. We had some criteria and reference also standards that are provided in the code today. The process would have taken projects directly to the City Commission under 306. Under 102, now we can no longer do residential. Now we have these provisions that talk about height and density in a different way, and it didn't give us as much leadway as what we thought we were going to be able to do with what we had created last December. So the bottom line is we wanted to come back and maintain some self-amending abilities for the residential districts. We also wanted to create more of we wanted to take this idea of administrative review and take some tiering and look at projects. So when we come back to you with the proposed amendments, we're going to be looking at the level of what someone is requesting and look at a process and LDR considerations that are in line with the request. For example, we had generally said we don't want to create higher densities where we have a conflict with single family, or we don't want to put anything, we're not allowing provisions in historic districts. That was under 306 anyway, that's pretty standard. But what we do want to do is encourage mixed use and workforce production in ways that are locationally sensitive. And we can do that by looking at densities. And I would tell you, we had a handful of projects that came in right before July 1st, which is when this new legislation would have made our current program provisions for the residential projects that were coming in, looking to increase density. We had a handful of projects come in, and they were coming in because it was these residential categories, but also the way you could apply this in mixed-use districts that would allow for more density in consideration for height that we had under 306. So we just want to restore some of those abilities, create some standards, and come back again with comp plan provisions, and then we'll have companion code revisions that'll follow up with that in the spring. And Alex is going to talk a little bit about the timing related to that, but you'll see all of this when we return.
Before you leave, does anyone have any questions? Or, because I have one, but I want to give others the chance first. So how much of the things we were allowed to do under the 306 that would have been changed are we able to restore by making these amendments?
Basically everything and a little bit more. What we really are doing is taking a step to give the city control.
Understood.
We expect there'll probably be another round of state policy changes again.
Right.
We're hoping that we can keep some consistency so that folks have some dependability of the
Understand.
process.
And maybe Alex might be a better one to answer, but I'd like to get your take. In the normal process, how closely are our changes scrutinized? How often do they reject proposed changes we want?
Okay, I'll tell you this, I'm an old school comp planner, right?
Okay.
So I worked on the first comp plan at the county eons ago. So the idea of a self-amending plan was something that ordinarily the state would never allow you to do as a local government. The fact that the state dictated that to us means they have to be acceptable to it. So the level of scrutiny, we all know, has changed at the state level. So we suspect this is a really good time to create these provisions and this kind of local control over it. So we think we'll be in a good position and be supported because of the fact this is to support the production of workforce housing.
Gotcha. Okay, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Oop, is it a question? Does someone have?
Yeah, actually, so what was the impetus for the legislature to change direction this
She
legislative
has to be
session?
diplomatic, I know.
Well, some of the other counties in the state didn't like the idea that you could come in and create more density in residential areas. And if you look at some of the language that's there, it's funny, even when they talk about height, they talked about, provide height relief up to, or at least as much as 3 stories. Well, to us, 3 stories is nothing, right?
Right.
In downtown areas and elsewhere. And again, it's this urban, more suburban, rural character, which some of the policy direction was really a reaction to. I mean, there were communities that said, well, we're not going to allow for these types of uses to come into our residential areas. So that was part of the backlash. Again, I think for us, we were already being proactive, and that's not really what the thought was there. And there has been some conversations. I know that the city will be having conversations. The county, other local governments are pushing that message back to say that, wait, it's not like peanut butter here. So it's just the difference in communities. And
So,
probably bill sponsors.
Yeah, a follow-up to that is, a few years ago, I remember there was some sort of rumor going around that, they're going to allow 4-family houses on the south end next to single-family homes, or 8, multi-unit houses in the south end. And so, does the comp plan that you're contemplating, or the changes that you want to make, would that allow for multifamily in a predominantly single-family area?
No, in fact, the sentiment was pretty clear in Resolution 30622 that we wanted to protect single-family areas and neighborhoods. We also wanted to, where we could, promote, and for example, if you think about Okeechobee corridor and some of those commercial areas, it makes sense to integrate some residential in some of those areas. It also makes sense for us to look at other places. Again, one of the things allowed in the legislation was to put housing in industrial areas, which we're like, okay, maybe. And we actually, under 30622, ID'd specific areas. You have to be context sensitive, and that's what we want to do. So we want to create general provisions in the EAR changes in the comp plan, and then we'll put some details and criteria in the code language.
Patrick, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a follow-up question, just putting all this in context. I think I recall the SB 102 this year. That was in response to Hurricane Ian, correct?
SB 102? Not really. It was a follow-up to, there were a lot of things that got attached into it. There's provisions for tax exemptions and other things. In terms of workforce housing, which is really what we're focused on, it went back into the same sections of state statute and sort of tweaked some of those parts. And those parts were specific. First, it talked about if you wanted to do, local governments have a right to create provisions for workforce housing. That was kind of a standard. Both the legislations did that. And then it created provisions under that. Some of them related to if it was a minimal amount, and then, they talk about an area median income level that, going up to as much as 120 there for some provisions. But then they created provisions that were more specific about things you must do. For example, one of the things we must do under 102 is we must allow a mixed-use residential project, which, by the way, mixed-use residential is an undefined term, which is one of the things that will probably happen this year at the state legislature. You must permit them to be approved administratively, okay? But it qualifies that that is a project that is a minimum of 65% residential, and it has a minimum of 40% of the units that will be workforce qualified, and they'll be held for 30 years. Well, to be honest, we don't get a lot of people beating down the door to do 40% workforce housing, and you know, I don't know that we necessarily have a problem with that if we have some caveats, but there's some undefined provisions there. So some of the Hurricane Ian stuff was really related to, there's been this ongoing discussion related to, and you'll see it sort of carry on. There was the Hometown Heroes and the other provisions for housing where they wanted to promote workforce housing for policemen and firemen and different provisions and encourage funding, because also a part of this whole SB 102 were the funding levels under SAIL and some of the state programs. Those provisions, kind of some of that lingers from some of the spending direction that happened after Hurricane Ian legislation, because they were trying to earmark some funds for home ownership and single family and that kind of thing without going on and on. But for the city, what we were focused on were these housing provisions under the 166 section of the state statute, 166.04151. And that section is what's dealing with, if you will, the production of these units in the residential, commercial, industrial, and mixed-use areas.
Thanks.
Just another clarification, there's a separate bill that dealt with simplifying the reconstruction of areas affected by hurricanes last year. So there is a separate bill, not Senate Bill 102, that dealt with reduction, let's say, in some of the processing times for rebuilding areas that were affected by hurricanes. So probably you were thinking of that other one. I forget the number for the bill, but
Yeah.
that's the one dealing with Hurricane Ian.
Thanks.
Going back to the timeline for the EAR, as I indicated earlier, we have been working and coordinating with different departments for the last few months. We're here, basically the second level here. We have workshop today with the planning board. Last week, we had a conversation, a similar conversation with the Downtown Action Committee. The reason why we are also meeting with the Downtown Action Committee is because any amendments to the Downtown Master Plan element of the comprehensive plan have to be seen by the Downtown Action Committee in addition to the planning board. Next, we're going to go in front of the Mayor Commission work session. That will be on August 28th. And then our expectation is to be back in front of you and DAC at the September meetings. At that time, we're actually going to have the specific language and the revised maps that I just referenced. Again, based on the requirements that the state imposed on us, we have to transmit or have to have the City Commission first reading before November 29th. So sometime in November, probably November 13th, is we're gonna go in front of the City Commission for the first reading. Then we're gonna be transmitting or sending to the state these amendments for their review. For the EAR-based amendments, the state as well as the other review agencies have up to 60 days to do the review. Typically it's 30 days for most amendments to the comprehensive plan. So they'll have 60 days to review, then they'll provide any comments. And at that point, we will be scheduling the second reading or adoption hearing. Right now, we're thinking it should happen sometime around March of next year. This is it, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I think so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ready, Mr. Chair, for the next item? Rick Green, Development Services Director. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the Curry Mixed Use District South expansion, something we are going to be bringing back to you in the immediate future, but just to kind of give you a very quick overview of what we'd like to do. And some of this you have seen in other projects in the past. But for the newer members, as you may know, we have 3 mixed-use districts in the city: the Broadway Mixed-Use District, the Northwood Mixed-Use District, and the Curry Mixed-Use District. The Curry Mixed-Use District is immediately west of Curry Park, bounded to the north, just north of 27th Street, to the south, just south of Pine Street, North Dixie Highway on the west, and Flagler Drive, for the most part, on the east. Back in 2004, we adopted some code changes in an effort to try to incentivize development within Curry Park. And what we did is identify certain areas within the district as CMUD Core, CMUD Edge, and CMUD Transition, allowing up to a maximum of 15 stories in height. There were height bonuses offered if conditions could be met. Again, the maximum height was 15 stories. And tied to what Alex covered earlier in the discussion on the EAR, it was determined that a maximum of 4,065 residential units could be built and 2.3 million square feet of retail and commercial within this geographic area. That's the point at which traffic will work sufficiently. So in the 10-year period between 2013 and 2023, we did not see a whole lot of activity. Neil Kosakoff built 2 projects on the south end of Curry. This one, Parkland, is finishing up. You had the Dr. Moore apartments to the north. Other than that, you can see the aerials over a decade in time remain for the most part the same. So the city recognized that we had to do something. So we did an inventory of every single parcel within the CMUD area, identifying the owner, the zoning, the acreage, the use, and then we identified that there were approximately just under 51 acres of development, excluding roads within the CMUD area. At the time, approximately 146,000 square feet of non-residential and just under 1,200 total units. And that 1,200 does include the Alara project that has not been built that you saw and approved several months ago. So we came up with a new zoning district, and this was approved by our city commission in 2021, that called for an edge district of 60 feet in height, a transition district reflected in the blue color allowing up to 163 feet in height, a core 2 district allowing up to 202 feet in height, a core 1 allowing up to 306 feet in height, and then a core 1A that allowed the developer to go to 350 feet if and only if he funded the improvement of Northwood Road expansion across Dixie Highway to tie into the new Curry Park. So basically, to achieve that 350, you had to build this roadway, and we are in that process right now. So you see to the left, there's a base height of 111 feet for the 3 core districts, Core 2, Core 1, and Core 1A. And again, depending on the floor-to-ceiling height, you see the number of stories that could be built in each district there. And to achieve the greater height in the core districts, as an example, above the 111 feet, there are certain incentives that were in place that a developer could attain to reach the greater height. Again, whether that improvement or that incentive be workforce housing, be further improvements to Curry Park, the provision of a grocery store, etc. So that's how a developer was to achieve height. And then the thought was that as we move from the center of the CMUD district, as we move north, the heights will get lower in size, in height, and the same to the south. So starting with a core of 350, we'd work our way southward and northward. So since that time, since the adoption of the new regulations in 2021, as this board is aware, we approved the Alara development consisting of 2 towers and 479 units. They are getting ready to begin construction. Neil Kosakoff is finishing his parkland on the park. And then we are also in review right now of a Jeff Green proposed project that would include 2 towers and 152 total units. And again, you hopefully will be seeing this in the near future. We're working through issues on that site plan as we speak. So with that, we said, well, let's look at expanding this district a little further to the south. So our initial study area was the very south end of the existing CMUD area, and we said, let's look at the properties that go all the way to Palm Beach Lakes, that abut Palm Beach Lakes at the Good Samaritan Hospital area. So again, as was mentioned earlier, a maximum of 4,000 residential units and 2.3 million square feet was permitted in the CMUD. And with that available capacity, we said we could expand CMUD to the south and still retain that same mixture because we didn't think it would be approaching that level of development or intensity. So we're leaving that square footage the same, but including a larger geographic area. Again, the areas to the south are mostly undeveloped at this time, and part of what the expansion would do is incentivize, like it did to the north, some of the developed or undeveloped properties in that area. And as we explain this, and I'll talk about the schedule in a few minutes, but as we explain this to the public, there are really 5 separate tracks that we're dealing with here. first and foremost is the revisions to the CMUD area that we did 2 years ago. So that's what's in place now. We are starting to see development arise as a result of that. Secondly, as you are aware, there was a request to rezone the Temple Israel site. That is part of the CMUD area. That is going to the City Commission the first week in September. That is not tied to the CMUD South expansion, but happens to be in the same general area. If the commission approves that rezoning, or if they do not, either way, Temple Israel will have to submit a specific site plan for that parcel. That has not been submitted to the city yet. So that's on a separate track. And again, based on the regulations within CMUD, this body would have the final approval of that design when and if it comes in. And then fourthly, really the purpose of this presentation tonight is to discuss with you and to inform you that we are looking at an expansion of the CMUD area to the south. Again, that's totally unrelated to the Temple Israel rezoning and eventual site plan application that may come in. And then fifthly, on a separate track as well, if the CMUD South expansion gets approved, there's a desire on the part of the related group to file an application for 1701 and 717 North Flagler. That application, again, has not been filed, but that is on a separate track and, again, not tied to the CMUD South expansion, other than if it gets approved, the height that they build will be predicated on what the commission eventually decides on the rezoning. So having said that, we're really here to talk about item number 4, which is the CMUD South expansion. So our schedule is, we did have a public meeting on July 27th. At that meeting, we were soliciting input. We gave a very similar presentation to what you're seeing tonight. We're both before you today, not seeking any input at this point, but just to kind of give you an overview of what we are working on. And again, you'll be seeing this in the near few months. We're going to have another meeting with the public next week. So next Monday, we'll have a second public meeting to solicit input. And then we'll come back to the planning board. We're probably leaning toward, given our schedule, probably leaning toward October 17th, but we'll bring all of the public input. We'll formulate some code changes, and then we'll bring that back for a formal motion. And then we'll take that to the City Commission, and again, we'll be required to have 2 readings. So we're hopeful that sometime near the end of this year, early part of next year, we will have effectuated those changes. So as we started looking at the CMUD South expansion area, we recognized that a lot of the land within this area is zoned professional office residential. That is a mixture of office uses and residential uses. You see that in the orange color. Primarily along North Dixie Highway, you see the general commercial colors in red. And then to our surprise, or maybe not a surprise, but a lot of the properties in here are zoned plan development, either office development, residential plan development, or POR, professional office residential plan development. So when you look and see all of the properties that are identified as POR, you've got Flagler Point, you've got Villa del Lago and Majestic Towers, 2 towers there, the Slade, of which you heard some comments at the last meeting, Flagler Waterview, and then, of course, Good Samaritan Hospital is all a community service plan development. So when you start looking at all the plan developments, it made sense for us not to include those PDs as part of the CMUD South expansion because they are governed by the existing plan development that's in place today. So when you exclude all of the areas in blue, 4 of the PDs are not contained within the CMUD South. Now, Flagler Point serves as the bridge, if you will, the connecting piece between CMUD to the north and the CMUD South expansion. So at this time, we're proposing to keep that into the CMUD South expansion, but the existing plan development will still govern any amendments or any changes they want to make in the future. So this is a summary of the 5 PDs that are in place. You see they go back to 1986 when Good Samaritan was approved. Some of the more recent ones are in 2001. And then you see Flagler Point was approved in 1998. So these are the ordinance and the subsequent amendments that govern those PDs. So again, in all future redevelopment, these plan developments will continue to govern the future development of those parcels. So as we ventured into the now somewhat restricted CMUD South area, excluding 4 of the 5 PDs, like we did with CMUD originally, we did an inventory of all of the parcels, property owners, acreages, and what we identified was there's approximately 17 acres of property there, 24 parcels about 113 existing non-residential square feet within the CMUD South expansion area, and 537 existing residential units. 400 of those 537 are located here in Flagler Point. So in summary, when you look at what the comprehensive plan allows for the CMUD area, again, the 4,000 residential units and 2.3 million, when you look at what's approved or built existing in CMUD today, again, it's just under 1,200 units, but that does include Olara, which is just starting construction now. It also includes Parkland on the Park, which is the 102-unit apartment complex Neil Kozakov is building. That constitutes approximately half of the existing units there today. And then you've got 146,000 square feet of non-residential. When you look at the CMUD South expansion area, just within the confines that we had identified, it's an additional 537 units, only 113 square feet of non-residential development, which leaves about 2,300 residential units, or almost 57% of the total capacity pursuant to our comp plan, and well over 2 million square feet of non-residential that could be built. So this is just a different view. You see the proposed area of the CMUD South expansion area highlighted in the green color. You see Flagler Point, some of the RPDs or PORPDs that were not included. Again, you're familiar with the Temple Israel site that you discussed the last meeting. And again, the piece that Related Group is looking at is the 1701 parcel. And then we are proposing the transition district on the west side along Dixie Highway. So the way it works with the incentives, I thought I'd include an example of how this works. So let's say you have a Core 1 property. Again, you start and you can build under the Core 1 a 306-foot tall building. Then you have a base height of 111 feet, which is approximately 8 stories. Again, your floor to ceiling may vary on each property. So you start with a base, and then you have a menu, if you will, of incentives that you can choose from. So in this particular example, if a developer wanted to provide 10% of the total units in workforce housing, they would get an additional 75 feet. If they added a grocery store to the base of the building, and it's a 15,000 square foot grocer, they could pick up another 100 feet of height. And then if they did a silver lead, they could get another 20 feet to get at the 306 feet in height. So the developer really has an array of different incentives that they can choose from. And as we ventured into the CMUD South area, we started looking at additional incentives that we might want to utilize for development, both in CMUD South as well as CMUD. And that is some of the feedback that we're trying to get from the residents. So you see on the left, these were the incentives that we had in place for the Curry Mixed Use District. This is what's in place today. So projects like Alara are choosing from this semblance of incentives that they can use. As we move into CMUD South, we didn't think it made sense to include the Northwood Road extension, which would be here, would not really apply to anything in the CMUD South area. And then similarly with the Curry Park parking, we had an incentive that if a developer wanted to provide additional parking that residents or visitors to Curry Park could utilize, they would be given an incentive there. Again, given the physical location of the Curry South area, we didn't think that incentive to move up here would make sense. So we're deleting those, but in discussions with residents and with city staff, we'd like to add 2 additional incentives that would include a seawall storm improvement. So as most of you know, there's a need, a desire to fix the seawall, not only in this area, but throughout the entire Flagler Drive corridor. So we came up at a formula in which a developer could help repair, fund the cost to repair portions of the seawall, and dependent on the amount of linear feet they could repair, they would be given the height incentive. Similarly, with Flagler Drive, there is a need to repair portions of Flagler Drive, repave the roadway, and again, that incentive would be provided. Now, if a developer comes in and there's a need to make improvements, if it's something that we can require as part of the development order, we would do that. But this would be over and above what may be required by the city staff or the board. Some of the other incentives that we're looking at that we're continuing to flush out are landscape and transportation improvements along Dixie Highway. It's a Florida Department of Transportation roadway, but if, again, a developer comes in and we can incentivize them to do additional roadway crossings, again, not adjacent to their project, but maybe further north or further south. Maybe do some landscaping enhancements, working with FDOT. That's something that we want to continue to flush out. And then similarly, with some of the tidal valve improvements we'd like to make to help some of the stormwater issues, that's an incentive that we'd like to include, maybe in our stormwater. So we're still, no pun intended, flushing through those issues, but we will go back to the public next week. And then ultimately, when we codify all of this, the incentives and then the language, we'll bring that back for a formal vote. And that concludes my presentation. It's a precursor. You're going to see a lot more in the future, but just to kind of give you a heads up of what you'll be seeing.
Yeah. Rick, I know it's early. It seems expansion makes a lot of sense. Are you encountering opposition in these early stages?
No, I don't think we're encountering opposition. I think most people are in support. The big issue certainly is going to be the height and what
Right.
areas we identify as Core 1, Core 2 transition. So,
Well, someone who lives very close to that area, your stormwater improvements and things would be welcome. With the street flooding that we have, there's been a real serious problem.
So on the proposal for the CMUD South, right now it's not determined how you're going to break that up with the 1, 2, or 3.
let me show you, I have a graphic. So this is what's proposed as of now. So this is the feedback that we're soliciting right now, is that the related group would be Core 1, and then the transition district would be everything behind that adjacent to Dixie Highway.
And there's really no developable property until you get down to Good Sam, right? Because you already, I mean, you have 1515, the Slade, Villa del Lago, those are all built, they're not going anywhere.
Along Flagler Drive, that's
Yeah.
correct, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I gotcha. And then the other question I had was, so the grocery store seems like a huge bonus. So if one of them picks the grocery store, then does that negate the others from 100 feet?
No, certainly market forces are going to dictate what incentive they use. And if I'm not mistaken, we have 2 square foot sizes. So there's a 15,000 square foot grocery store, and I believe it's a 30,000 square foot. If you do the 30, you get more of a height incentive, less if you do 15. But we think there's a need for a grocery store in this area. So we actually applied a greater incentive in an effort to try to get more people to do the grocery store. I would argue we did the same thing for workforce housing. We have a very generous incentive for workforce housing in an effort to try to encourage developers to choose that option as the incentive they want to pursue.
Yeah, I've been hearing for 20 years, we've been trying to get Publix up there, so.
I know, at
It's
least 20 years.
it's a good incentive, I think.
And we've heard rumors, and we actually were negotiating with a developer once to lay it out, and we thought we were making progress, and then that deal fell apart, so it never came to fruition, unfortunately.
I have one question. With the expansion, are you all looking to raise the overall dwelling unit number? Or is that 4,000 number going to be for the
No,
expanded?
what was approved as part of the CMUD expansion to the north of 4,000 residential units, our goal is that whatever happens in this area would be part of that 4,000. So if anything, it's probably encouraging lesser development, because in fact, what we're doing is using the same cap, the same threshold, if you will, except now we're including everything that we're going to add to CMUD South. That will still be part of the 4,000 and 2.3 million square feet. We're not going to do in
Right.
addition to.
Essentially just spreading it out.
Yeah.
And then I know crossing our streets can be challenging. So you had mentioned some stuff on the Dixie Highway side. Is there going to be additional incentives to create crosswalks or pedestrian, flashing lights, et cetera,
Yes.
along Flagler?
Yes, and that was one of the incentives that we were talking about. Let me find the slide.
It's a huge challenge. I mean, we live right there, right by Good Sam, and you always have to run across the street. I don't care how careful you are.
So Well, we may lump that into mobility options. I mean, we don't know exactly where we'll put it, but that was the thought, is that whether we have a separate category for Dixie Highway improvements, certainly the crossings on Flagler, we can include as part of the Flagler Drive, but something like that,
Well,
particularly
the
on the Dixie
standing
side.
water, the stormwater does slow down the traffic, so we have that going for us. That's our best device now.
My last question is, along the mobility options, does Palmtran run a bus route along Flagler?
I'll defer to Alex on US 1, but not Flagler.
Okay.
But one of the incentives we had in there, I know it may be a reach, but we had talked about maybe having some type of shuttle or trolley system that would extend up through the CMUD area. And again, that could help fund as part of one of the options we had.
Well, I mean, will Curry Park have a, some sort of bus stop or something there? Is the goal to get people to Curry Park, or to really make Curry Park sort of the anchor of that area for residents?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we would love to have people there. As I'm sure the board is aware, we're beginning a $35 million renovation of the park that hopefully will start later this year. But once completed, I'm sure there are going to be efforts to try to bring people to that area. But at this point, I couldn't tell you if that's going to happen.
Any other questions? And if not, does that conclude what
Yep,
you
thank
want
you
us
very
to do?
much.
So we
More to
only
come.
have unfinished business or new business, and if not, we stand adjourned. Hey, Rick, now that we're adjourned, is Carla